Hey, loves. It's Abigail here to normalize these conversations and education about death and dying so we die better end of life. Today, I want to talk about dying alone and exploring that a little bit more. So let's get into it. I recently continued a series on social media about dying alone. And I first started it out with asking people, um, kind of what came up for them when they thought about themselves dying alone. Because I think a lot of people have assumptions about certain things around this topic, especially, but they're not always, their assumptions are not necessarily accurate. So I'm going to kind of get into that a little bit more. I picked this topic especially because, not only are we naturally really afraid of dying, which is a really natural, normal thing, but the dying alone part is also a very kind of kind of goes it's kind of partnered with that often, but not in the way necessarily that you think or that's maybe totally obvious. And what's very surprising is that most people were really worried about how their loved ones, their caregivers, their people who would be there at the bedside, and kind of what the experience was for them. So I'm going to tell you about what I saw, especially in the field, um, as a director, and also just from what I heard on social media. So the one thing that was most seen in the field for me, and that seemed to kind of also come across in social media, was parents or guardians, anyone in a guardian type of role, really would wait until their children, especially, would leave the room to die. And it was so much so that I became fully convinced that this was true because I would see time and time again, whether it was at the bedside or whether I heard from my previous staff, where a patient was hanging on for, way beyond than what we thought they could hang on for. And then the second that child left the room to say, go to the bathroom, the parent died or the guardian died. It would also be, and this is why it's also really important to talk to your loved ones who are dying, where they had another parent who was dying and then their kid came in from overseas. And the second before, or minute before, the kid walked into the room of that dying parent, the parent would die. So just before that kid walked in the room. And this is why I do talk about how important it is to talk to your loved ones who are dying, because then you still give them agency over, when they can die and how they can die. So it's easy, just easily talk to them how you would normally talk to them. Hey, it's so and so. I'm going to stay here for a little bit, but right now I'm leaving. I got to go home and take a shower and I'll be back in the morning, that kind of stuff. Just basic type of communication that you would have done with them and how you would communicate, you coming and going. And when the person and other people come, it's important for them to announce themselves and also tell them they're going to leave. Because then that person who's dying still has agency over when they can die. And I know my experience is anecdotal, but I have seen it and I heard about it so many times in my 20 or so years in the medical field, 15 of those being in hospice and palliative care, of course, where this happened over and over and over again. It was really amazing to me. So, yes, I have come to a conclusion. I've come to this belief that people really do die when they're ready to die. And parents and guardians, especially, or if anyone in this kind of caretaking guardian type of role, really like to, I always say, be the parent until the very end, or be the guardian until the very end, and not die in front of their children or the people who were like children to them. And that doesn't mean anything good or bad. It's just what they choose to do. And so I really do believe that they're like a mother is a mother to the very end, a father is a father to the very end, or what guardians are guardian to the very end. And sometimes they choose not to die in front of their relationships or their people who are considered children to them. And I really bring this up because it's so important for people to understand that if you're not there at the time of your loved one's death, um, you didn't do anything wrong and you didn't mess up and you didn't make a mistake. I've seen people who physically there was no explanation as to why they were still alive. I mean, they didn't eat in weeks, they didn't drink, and physically they should have died. There was no physical explanation as to why they were still alive, but they hung on really because I think the human spirit sometimes has this strength and has this way of forging us on for whatever reason. Now, there are other things that I think that can happen. I think a lot of people who have unsettled things, maybe from what I would see, and especially when this was paired with agitation, people hanging on paired with agitation, it's usually something like someone was hanging on for some reason because something was not resolved, and they couldn't die without that being resolved. So then we talk to the other family members and say, is there something that Joe here didn't forgive himself for, that maybe he needs some forgiveness around this or something like that? And sometimes we didn't always know. So we would have to work with our hospice team and really talk to that person who was dying in a way that would help them understand that this is your chance. And it's perfectly fine to forgive yourself, and it's perfectly fine to go when you feel ready, when it's right for you, and yada, yada, yada. These aspects of medical care and nursing in particular, because I'm a nurse, I didn't learn until I was in hospice. Even though I was practicing, I really felt some kind of level of hospice when I was working in the ICU and taking care of dying people. Um, I didn't learn these things until I went into hospice and really thinking about the existential type of spiritual distress, existential distress, emotional pain, and all this type of stuff, and how that carries the body into situations where you just, that are really hard to kind of explain logically. But again, I have seen it so many times at the bedside. I heard it so much from my previous staff. It's You can't ignore it. You can't ignore it. And when I asked for the questions on social media about dying alone, what was so interesting is the guardians, people who said, "Oh, I don't want my children to see me dying. I just want them to be relieved of that." It was so interesting how they themselves weren't really worried about dying alone, but they were more concerned with not dying in front of their children. And from what I have seen over and over and heard, I'm pretty sure they're not going to allow themselves to die in front of their children. I know we don't have full control, but there is a sense of control. We do have some control over how we die, which is why we're talking about this. But this is such an interesting topic to me. So, anyway, this whole dying alone thing. Now, this fear, though, of dying alone is a very real fear because it makes us feel really vulnerable as to, what can happen. And really, when it comes down to it, what it really seems like is people are really afraid of just the discomfort, um, and not being, not having someone there to make sure that they're okay, that they're comfortable, that they're going to be okay, that they're safe, that they can die peacefully and they can have a good death. And this is why, we talk about not dying without hospice care. You're going to die. I mean, I would talk to people too that they knew they were sick, they knew they were going to die in a matter of weeks, and they just didn't want to be in hospice care because they didn't want to deal with visits, they didn't want to deal with doctors or nurses or whatever. But you're going to die, and why not ensure that you can have the best death possible and have the right care there? So this is why it is so critical. Yes, you always hear me talk about getting hospice on board because we are going to die. So you need to die with hospice. So I know we kind of went and touched on a few little things here and there about this dying alone, but it is really true that people will decide when to die. Now, when I did talk about these cases where parents, often guardian type of relationships, would wait until they were alone to die, this wasn't just with guardians, but this was anyone who kind of assumed this caregiver type of role to somebody. They didn't want to die necessarily in front of them. Now, there were some people who, yes, they would wait until the very minute that loved one from overseas walked in the door, and then they would die right then and there once they walked through the door. So they waited that 1 second for that other person to see them right before they died, and then they died. It doesn't mean that they love you any less or more. That doesn't mean at all. Every single one of us has our own agency and own way that we want to die. And for many people, might be dying alone. And this doesn't mean that you're not going to be cared for, especially if you already have things like hospice medical care in place. Remember, hospice is legitimate medical care covered by insurance. So this is just something I want you to explore. I want to know what else comes up for you, especially after listening to this. Let me know what you think. And of course, let's continue these conversations and education about death and dying so we die better at the end of life. And of course, hopefully live a good one till we get there. I will talk to you soon. Love you always. Bye.